Yo, what's up guys, welcome back to another video. This is a reaction to this will happen if the US pulls out of NATO. And I mean, I guess it's just a concept idea of if the US left NATO, and I mean how it would most likely fall apart. Because in terms of power, I mean, I say the US would have 80% in terms of the strength of the military and all the, just I guess the influence as well. 80 to 90% of all of NATO. So I mean, you've probably got Germany with like 5%, France with like 5%, the UK of like 1% or something like that. But yeah, so I mean, if this did happen, I would assume NATO would probably fall apart, because I think the whole point was the US are like protecting these countries, but then the countries are also gonna sort of stick with the US if they need help with things. I don't actually know if that's the case, but I know it's a big organisation and it was important for after the World Wars, and it wasn't the World Wars, it was to do with communism, right? I think the NATO was made because of the rise of the Soviet Union and like communism spreading and stuff. But yeah, we're going to check this out and see. Hopefully going to enjoy. It's obviously a concept idea, so I don't know how correct everything will be, but I'm not that fast either way. But we're going to check this out. Links are in the description to my Patreon if you want to see some more of my reactions that I can't post to YouTube. TV series, movie reactions, all that good stuff. Links are there for those interested, but let's check this out.
This episode is brought to you by Dashlane. Try Dashlane Premium free for 30 days at dashlane.com/infographics. And never forget another password and keep all your online accounts secure. Here at the Infographics Show, we come up with all kinds of interesting topics and ideas to research for your entertainment. But sometimes, we like answering a question directly from you, the fans. Today, we're going to look at a huge what-if scenario submitted by fan Jochi, who asked us what would happen if the US were to pull out of NATO. Concern for an American withdrawal from NATO is not without precedent. Famously, now President Trump often bemoaned the alliance during the 2016 election, saying that the US should pull out of it and that it no longer served American interests to remain in NATO. While that statement was not just completely factually incorrect, it ultimately proved to be nothing more than political grandstanding for votes, and the US today firmly remains in NATO. Yet American sentiments on both sides of the political aisle that European member states don't pull their fair share with the alliance are not without merit. Per a 2014 agreement, each nation is meant to fund its military at 2% of GDP, with 20% of that spent on equipment. After World War II, the US was happy to bear the majority cost of defending Europe as European nations rebuilt themselves after World War II. However, over the next almost 7 decades, nations would consistently fail to meet funding goals. And when President Trump took office in 2016, only Britain and the US were meeting that 2% goal. Today, Greece, Britain, Estonia, and Poland are the only nations to meet or exceed 2% spending, though 15 total nations of the 29 member states are on track to meet that goal sometime in the 2020s. Simply put, many Americans are tired of bearing the cost of defending Europe, while Europeans seem generally disinterested in doing so. In fact, the atrophying of Europe's defense industry is largely thanks to the security umbrella that the US has provided for almost 7 decades. And with thousands of American servicemen stationed across Europe, European nations have traditionally seen little need to be responsible for their own defense.
I mean, you see a lot of help that Europe gets from the US in many wars and just things like this, right? And then Europeans seem to have a hatred towards the US. Maybe, I mean, there's definitely reasons in terms of like wars that maybe shouldn't have happened and things that shouldn't have happened, right? But in terms of protecting Europe, they're the reason Europe's been, I mean, some part of Europe has been without war for years and years now, which was not the case with World War II, World War One. Before that, even maybe parts after that, you've had like the Balkan Wars and stuff, and just things that have like always spilled out in parts of Europe. But I say the west side of Europe and sort of Central Europe have been, and Northern Europe as well, have been pretty much like free of all of the fighting and wars and stuff. And I'd say a big part of that is thanks to NATO, and in turn of that, the US military, right? But I guess in terms of the money spent, some people from the US are like, this doesn't really benefit us, which is fair enough. There's probably more to it that I don't know, but that's like a brief sort of summary of what I've seen before and then obviously seeing already in this video.
Past a token force. So what if America said, enough is enough, and decided to withdraw from NATO. What would happen in the alliance, and how could it fare in a war against, say, China or Russia? First, if the US packed...
If the US left NATO and then NATO was left to fend themselves off from Russia and China, I mean, Russia in terms of GDP would be outnumbered by Europe, right? Because there's so many wealthy countries in Europe. But in terms of the military and stuff, I think it would be a lot harder because Russia just has a very strong military compared to these European countries, probably because they've been so reliant on the US for protection.
Up all its toys and went home, a whopping 75% of military hardware on the continent would suddenly disappear, along with about 50,000 troops. The United States operates its military on a total war footing, meaning that it dedicates resources to ensure supremacy in all areas of warfare: land, sea, space, and cyberspace. Few other nations, however, match this capability, and most NATO forces aside from France, Italy, Spain, Turkey, and the UK don't have a diverse enough military to carry out a true combined arms war against a modern adversary such as Russia. The most immediate problem NATO would face would be a severe lack of space-based communications and intelligence assets, as the majority of NATO's space resources are American, and American units process and disseminate this information to NATO partners. The second major obstacle for NATO would be a lack of transportation assets. In our previous video, The United States versus the World, we showed you that in total global war against the US, the American military would be able to fight the world's militaries to a draw and prevent any invasion of the American homeland. This is due to two factors. The United
Wait, when he says that, he means the entire, basically, if the whole world was against the US's military, they'd be able to fend that off. I don't know how true that is, but I mean, I guess the argument is there because there's so much power, but it's just fascinating to even think about. Obviously, I'm sure that will never happen, but...
States Navy and its transportation capabilities. Simply put, the world lacks enough military transportation capability and the naval assets to defend that cargo to ever threaten the United States. Guns aren't worth a damn if you can't bring them to the battlefield or if they get sunk en route. Take China, for example, a modern military power with a huge thorn in its side, Taiwan. The tiny island defiantly refuses reunification with the mainland. And yet, though the Chinese military greatly dwarfs the small Taiwanese forces, China is completely incapable of crossing the 110 miles to get to the island. It lacks the air and naval transportation capabilities to pull this very tiny trip off. And any attempt to invade Taiwan by China's juggernaut military would end in a total bloodbath for the People's Liberation Army. NATO, however, is in an even worse position for transporting troops and equipment to a modern battlefield. During the Falklands War between Great Britain and Argentina, had Argentina used its navy more efficiently, it would have absolutely trounced British forces. Due to the low numbers Britain could successfully ferry across the Atlantic at the time, even with the objective being the securing of a tiny strip of islands, Britain could barely manage to procure enough transportation capability to conduct a maritime assault, and had to press civilian ships into service. Even then, it was covert American assistance that saw Britain's tank forces ships refuel en route to the Falklands, and American aircraft that flew British personnel to Ascension Island, a staging ground for the invasion. It was also American...
I didn't even know that either. I don't know much about the Falkland War. It's one of those, like, the most fascinating things over this tiny little bit of land that's so far from Britain, but I didn't know they had that help from the US.
In satellite intelligence that averted a potential total defeat when the CIA informed the British that their invasion force would be going up against 2 to 3 times the number of defenders they originally believed they would be facing. In modern times, things haven't gotten much better, and the British Navy has actually shrunk in size. Several ships have even had to be cannibalized of crew so that Britain's new aircraft carriers could be activated. The French and Italians are in better position to move NATO troops around, but even their current fleets don't allow those nations to do much more than small expeditionary sorties, such as France's current ongoing counterterrorism operations in Africa. In essence, NATO would be all but paralyzed as it tried to move troops and equipment to war fronts due to a severe shortage of transportation assets. The best that NATO could manage would be a European defense, as the alliance has absolutely no capability to respond to threats outside of the European theater. A war with China would thus be impossible, although to be fair, China itself also cannot wage war outside of its own borders. The third problem that NATO would face would be the leadership vacuum caused by the US's exit from the alliance. Without any other nation being truly militarily superior, Though France is certainly neck and shoulders above the others, it would be difficult to determine just who would run the alliance during wartime. A crisis against Russia would require a unified command structure, and right now, no nation seems capable of stepping in and filling that role. Thanks to the disastrous decision to leave the EU, Britain would likely be far too resented by the other Euro powers to allow it to lead. And
Oh God.
highly divisive internal politics in France and Germany would likely preclude them from taking leadership. Turkey is seen today by many as a rather reluctant partner in NATO, and were war to break out between a divided NATO and Russia, there's no telling if Turkey would honor its commitment to the alliance. But let's say that NATO did manage to pull itself together enough to resist a Russian invasion, if for some reason Russia did want to invade. Well, right now, NATO's easternmost neighbors, such as Estonia and Latvia, face about 46 battalions of Russian tanks, infantry, and other forces. By comparison, NATO only has 11 battalions currently defending that area.
All this has probably changed, right, since the war in Ukraine. And this video is like 3 years old, so I'm sure some things have changed, but even in these times, that the difference in how much they're outnumbered is crazy.
And most of those forces are light infantry forces with little heavy equipment. NATO could effectively surge an additional 8 battalions in an emergency, but 7 of those battalions right now would be American. Without the US, NATO can only surge a single battalion into an eastern emergency, bringing NATO troop numbers to 12 battalions versus Russia's 46. Not only would NATO forces be initially outnumbered, but Russia could call up to 20 million reservists relatively quickly, while NATO has varying levels of readiness on a nation-by-nation basis. In the air, NATO and Russia have a relative parity, with both nations roughly having the same number of fighter aircraft. However, Russia has an advantage in attack aircraft, numbering 1,459 versus NATO's approximately 1,300. Russia without a doubt fields the best air defense system in the world in the S-300, 400, and the new 500 model. And without American stealth assets or long-range cruise missiles to destroy those systems, or the command and control nodes that support them, NATO air forces would be savaged as long as Russia advanced slowly across Europe, allowing time for its air defenses to reposition and cover troop movements. Targeting would also be a major problem for NATO forces, who would no longer have access to American recon assets or satellites to relay information on enemy troop movements and locations. With a massive advantage in electronic warfare, Russian forces could potentially make coordination and communication between NATO forces very difficult. On the ground, Russian tank forces would dwarf NATO forces, with roughly 20,000 tanks at its disposal versus NATO's 3,600. Granted, many of Russia's stated tank numbers are actually Cold War-era relics, which would require weeks of maintenance to make combat worthy, but even without these tanks, Russia still fields a very sizable force of modern and postmodern but still capable tanks. A more accurate Russian number would be 2,600 of immediately available tanks, though no doubt many of those in reserve would be reactivated in the build-up to war. With almost 4,000 rocket artillery, though, Russia would decimate NATO forces who can barely field 400 units of their own. Traditionally, NATO relied on more accurate air power rather than ground artillery, but most of that air power was American in nature and is no longer now available. While Russia also has an advantage in traditional artillery, rocket artillery is especially devastating, as it allows the launching of massive amounts of firepower in a very short time, not giving the defenders a chance to relocate or dig into defensive positions. Russia's advantage in this arena would leave NATO forces struggling to pull themselves together in an environment that would look like the cratered surface of the moon.
Do NATO, have they got any, without NATO, without the US, do they have any advantages at all, like in a war versus Russia? I would have assumed they would have stood a bit more of a chance. I know this channel is quite dramatic in certain ways, and maybe it's a bit off here and there, but if this is the case, god damn. I thought some of the European countries had some decent military strengths. I know Russia is very big and powerful, but when you've got like Germany, France, I guess Italy, Spain, and I guess the UK, I don't know how good that is, but in the world, they're still like some of the most powerful ones, right? But I guess Russia are just very prepared for this sort of circumstance. But I guess, I mean, this probably won't ever happen, right? Because even now with the war in Ukraine and stuff, that's all to do with NATO, isn't it? Like NATO sort of wanting to join, so Ukraine wanting to join NATO, and I think NATO were like, nah, we're not gonna get involved until you start attacking a country that is part of NATO. But yeah, it's a lot of weird little things to it.
Although NATO could field about 2 million personnel versus Russia's 1 million,
finally we win in some aspect.
These personnel all have varying degrees of readiness, as does their equipment. Famously, Germany's Air Force was discovered to be completely incapable of carrying out wartime operations this past summer, due to a shortage of personnel and equipment, both. Its Navy also faces similar problems, leaving in question the utility of a keystone member of a European-only alliance. Turkey also makes up the bulk of European NATO forces, and
Turkey! But then they're not really necessarily wanting to get involved in a war if it happens.
Given its strained relation with other NATO members and a lack of strong leadership should the US step out of the alliance, it's not known if Turkey would support NATO in a war against Russia. NATO could not hope to operate in the short term without the US's continued support, though there is hope that if the US left and there was no immediate emergency, the alliance could manage to pull itself together in time and become a fighting force capable of at least defending Europe. With the balance of global power shifting across the Atlantic to the Pacific in a new tug-of-war between the US and China, though, NATO will have to greatly expand its expeditionary capabilities if it doesn't want to live in a world dominated by China's influence and under global rules imposed by the Chinese Communist Party. If NATO wanted to remain viable in a war without the US, then immediate steps must be taken to address critical shortfalls in key areas. A dramatic expansion of expeditionary capabilities would be critical not just for fighting conflicts far from home, but to rapidly move forces to potential flashpoints with Russia. This means a larger naval transport fleet and the surface and undersea assets to protect those ships, as well as a huge expansion of current air transportation fleets. Next, the alliance would have to address a critical lack of space assets, as without US support, the meager European space infrastructure that does exist would be very quickly dismantled in war. While the US has a fleet of ready-to-deploy space assets in case of wartime attrition of current assets, as well as the space government and civilian infrastructure to launch those assets, Europe largely lacks the physical hardware to replace any current losses in space, though it at least has adequate delivery solutions thanks to the robust European Space Agency. Transportation, intelligence, and leadership are NATO's greatest weaknesses without the US, quickly followed by a severe lack of heavy combat equipment needed to stop a modern combat force. Yet these are problems that can be overcome with the refocusing of European military priorities, and in the long run, NATO could survive without the United States. For the US's part, any talk of leaving the alliance would be tantamount to shooting itself in the foot, even if anger at shouldering the bulk of the cost of European defense is itself not without merit. European forces have proven steadfast allies for the United States in a variety of conflicts, and the 7 decades of peace in Europe are a testament to the ultimate victory of NATO, which has so far succeeded with all members united in preventing a future war. Traditional warfare isn't the only threat that might follow the US pulling out of NATO. Cyber wars between huge nations don't just target each other's military forces, but regular people like you and me. And it's your...
Oh, again yet? Come on. Get that money. Europe, we don't need the US. USA, fine. We will leave. Russia, hello. Ukraine, not again. Oh, God, that's before it even happened as well. Imagine USA leaving NATO and suddenly Russia joining NATO. That's just not going to happen, but... The US leaving NATO is the equivalent of Goku and Vegeta leaving the Z fighters. A modern military like Russia, well, that aged like milk. I guess so. I guess that's somewhat the case, but... While I can't believe America's back is still in working condition with all that team carrying. It goes back to a quote from World War II. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto as saying, "You cannot invade mainland United States. There would be a rifle behind." Yeah, that's true. But yeah, USA leaves NATO. Canada declares itself US territory. But yeah, hopefully you enjoyed this reaction and let me know your thoughts. Obviously, this is a concept sort of thing that's not actually happened. And I guess with events that have happened since then, maybe this wouldn't necessarily be the case. I do see the point of the reliance of NATO countries, bar the US, that they have on the US, which is probably why they don't spend as much on their militaries. And if they did, obviously, I assume that there's some powerful countries there, so they could build towards having a strong military. But it does show the reliance on the US, and I can sort of see the anger in some people's minds from people from the US of how much they spend, because if they just spend 30% less than they do obviously it's maybe in the US's interest to spend that as well, because they want to be seen as a global superpower, and this sort of thing is helpful towards that. But then they could spend it towards things that could benefit the people of the US. But there's two sides of it, right? I see both sides, and it's an interesting argument. But let me know your thoughts, and until next time, peace.